Good morning, everybody. I'm afraid I'm going to be giving this talk in English, so I hope you can understand more than I have understood so far. Apologies. So I've been given, I think, 7 minutes to talk to you about a question that we've been asking for about 200 years, if not longer. I will do my best. My apologies in advance. I arrived here at about 2:30 this morning, courtesy of Storm Boris. Can't get away from him, even if I've left the UK. And I also have the most terrible cold, so I hope you won't pick up too much of that. As I think I was introduced, as I'm a neuroscientist, I spend a lot of my time metaphorically rooting around in people's brains using different types of brain imaging techniques. And what I'm really interested in is what makes brains different. And as a consequence of that, having looked at over most of my career looking at different kinds of brains, I recently wrote a book called The Gendered Brain, which actually said, how good is the evidence that there are clear differences between male and female brains? And I think mainly I'll be talking about that particular question in the next 5 or 6 minutes. Really important to know why we are asking this question. Why are we asking if there's such a thing as a male brain or a female brain? I'm not a sex difference denier, which is one of the politer things I've been called since I wrote the book. I do believe that, of course, biology, male and female biology, has some kind of input into the kind of questions we might be interested in asking about how the brain affects people's abilities, their behavior, their temperament, their illnesses, etc. And so what we need to say, if we're interested in sex differences in disease, like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, that's important to understand, and probably the biology is a core question there. But once we get down to, just trying to see if this, yes, this kind of question, which I think is what this talk today is about, is what has the brain got to do with sex differences overall, what kind of abilities that people have, and in particular, gender gaps in society. And the difference between the term sex and the term gender is something which take up the whole of the 7 minutes, but we'll come back to that perhaps in the end. Draw your attention to a particular question, which I think has been sort of talked about in these beginning remarks, looking at the World Economic Forum, who tracks gender equality in all the different countries across the world and has been doing that for nearly 20 years now. The latest statistic says that if we're hoping to close the worldwide gender gap, we're going to have to wait about 135 years. And I would point out that that's a whole generation longer than before lockdown. So we're not actually making a huge amount of progress, and that's something that we should be aware of. Okay, so this is the old-fashioned model, what I call the old-fashioned model, the thing that I was challenging when I wrote the book, and that is what I call the inside-out model, that there is some kind of inevitable, fixed, invariant pathway towards these gender gaps. So whatever it is, bearing in mind that we asked this question end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, and you didn't at that point know what determined male and female anatomy, whatever it was that determined male and female anatomy determined the kind of brain you had. So if you had female anatomy, you had a lady brain, and if you had a male anatomy, you had a manly brain. And inevitably, with those two different kinds of brains, came two different kinds of abilities. Women were very good at understanding emotions, but rubbish at reading maps and being scientists and things like that. Whereas men were brilliant at mental rotation, abstract thinking, logic, reason, but rubbish at listening. And these were kind of distinct and binary, which is another issue that we will perhaps come on to later. And once you had that set of abilities, then there was a kind of inevitable result that you had different kinds of jobs, places in society, different expectations, a whole load of stereotypes was fed by this particular idea. So the idea is that actually gender gaps were inevitable, essential even, using the term in the biological sense. And there were statements like, the female brain is hardwired, and that's quite an important phrase to understand, for empathy. So you had the brain you were born with, and that gave you a certain set of skills, and that gave you a place in the job market, or not, which is another issue we should talk about. So I think things have actually changed quite a lot, excuse me, in the last 30 or 40 years, thanks to brain imaging and colleagues of mine moving our understanding of the brain on. We now know that this isn't just, our brains are not just vacuum packed. They don't arrive and they have a particular set of skills which carry you through life. What they also say is this whole idea of a male and female brain is based on this assumption that if you're a female, you have this kind of brain. If you're a male, you have that kind of brain. That has been completely, if you like, blown out of the water over the last, hopefully a bit by my book, but also by all sorts of intense scrutiny of the last 30, 40 years of brain imaging data, which says if you look at all of the papers, look at how reliable the differences are, how big the differences are, where the differences are, there is really no difference. And once you connect for size, there is no difference in the structures of male and female brains. And psychologists have done the same thing and said, we have this idea that men are like this, and Mars and Venus, for example, women are like that. Looking at all of that research, you can say, actually, that's not true. So we have this kind of nice chain of argument, and bits of it have already been blown out of the water. So what's going on? Well, this is where I've been working, and this is where we come on to what I call the outside-in model. We now know that the brain has I've just realized that you've got a different set of slides up, but never mind. We now know that the brain has a huge amount of, is influenced a huge amount by the outside world. It's not just itself running itself in its own engine. Things that happen in the outside world really change the brain. So this is not an either nature or nurture argument. It's the fact that nature and nurture are very much entangled, if you want to think of those terms. So we have an idea here, and this is, again, another whole talk in itself, so I'll just very briefly summarize it. The idea that we have a brain which is actually looking in the outside world, trying to work outside the rules of engagement, could be sights and sounds, but it could also be social rules. So we have a predictive brain, which is actually interacting with the outside world, generating what I call a kind of sat-nav approach, and saying to its owner, if you like, if you find yourself in this situation, this is going to be good for you, or if you find yourself in that situation, do a U-turn when possible. The other thing that we need to look at is the fact that the brain is plastic, that we actually, the experiences we have, the things that we learn, the experiences we don't have also, will change the way in which the brain develops. That's really important because the old-fashioned idea had this idea that the brain was fixed. Once it stopped growing, nothing happened to it, the functions remained the same, etc. We now know that's not true, and there's been all sorts of very clever experiments done on looking at taxi drivers learning their way around places like London, for example, or very important, learning to juggle or play Tetris, etc. You could actually show that bits of the brain would change by those experiences, and the functions that the structures subserved also changed. So our brain is plastic, interacts with the outside world. And I'll come back to that before I move on to the next slide. But the next issue is the fact that our brain is also what I call permeable. So I've called these the 3 Ps. Our brain actually doesn't function in a social vacuum either. You can show that if you say to a group of people like you, which is, I think, a telling phrase in understanding stereotypes, for example, are not very good at this sort of problem, but we want to see what happens in your brain when you're trying to solve it, put them in the scanner. Another group of people like you, are really good at this sort of problem, so we want to see what happens, put them in the scanner. You give both groups an identical task. But what you find is that the group who had the negative message actually performs worse, and different parts of their brain are activated. So that, in fact, the parts of the brain are activated are the parts of the brain which are more kind of emotional, error, monitoring, etc., but not the parts of the brain which would be most useful for solving the problem. The people who've been given the positive message make fewer mistakes, and also you'll find that the part of the brain activated is the most useful or appropriate part. So what we then say is, okay, so we've got a brain which is, if you like, listening to attitudes in the outside world. And if you had the slides that I thought you were going to have, there would have been a third image there, which is a lot of the work that I've been doing, which is saying, if you look at social information as well, you can show how that will change the brain, in particular negative social information. So you can actually model tasks, social rejection tasks in a scanner, and you can show how that will activate different parts of the brain. So having a negative social experience, which is something that the outside world does to you, will change your brain. And I think that's quite important to understand. Okay, so we now have an idea that we have this brain, which is this 3P brain, which is interacting with the outside world. And this is what I think is really important for this conference to understand. Because we now know that the world is a brain influencer. So if we're going to try and understand gender gaps, and we think they might be something to do with the brain, then it's no point just looking at the brain and the individual. What is it in the outside world that might actually be changing those brains? And one of the things we might like to look at is a gendered world. Do we live in a gendered world? Well, I think I could probably guess the answer to that. So if you've got a world full of stereotypes, which says women are like this, women can do that, or men are like this and men can do that, or they can't. And that occurs from the moment of birth. If you think about those ghastly gender reveal parties, I don't know if they've reached you here, but that certainly indicates quite clearly how our society feels it's really important that we know whether somebody's male or female, 20 weeks before they even arrive on this planet. And then all the toys, the pink and the blue, tsunami as I've called it, the toys, school attitudes, etc. So you then get 6-year-old girls thinking they're not really, really clever, 9-year-old girls saying that maths is a boy thing, etc. So this starts very early. So outside influences will change the brain, and you can actually monitor that in the brain. The other thing which relates very much to the negative social information I was talking about is that we now know that a sense of belonging is a really important part of the human brain's way of survival. We really, really need to belong, and there's clear evidence, particularly the social rejection work that I've been doing, which shows that if you don't feel that you belong, or if you're in a situation where you're rejected, it changes your brain and it changes your behavior. And you may well leave the situation that you're in, or you will withdraw from any support, etc. So it's really important that in the outside world, there's clear evidence that you see other people who are behaving like you. You feel a sense of inclusion. And I think that's really important when we're talking about diversity and inclusivity initiatives. Diversity and inclusivity. Diversity on its own is not enough. You need to make sure that people are included. And if you don't, and there's powerful evidence of sexism and sexist remarks and expectations of people in the outside world, then that will change how people's brains work. And whatever you do to try and set up training situations, etc., that won't work. And that also applies to an area that I'm really interested in, the underrepresentation of women in science. And there is a claim that, in the most gender-equal countries, science is a level playing field. And maybe the same thing has been said about any organization that you're involved in. And you're really, gosh, haven't we made a lot of difference? We've appointed lots of people. We've set up lots of training opportunities. And then you say, yes, but they only stay 4 or 5 years, etc. And then, so there must be, and this is where the biological argument, the essential argument re-emerges, there must be some kind of biological preference determining why women don't choose science, etc. So you really need to ask yourself, is the culture in which this brain is working a level playing field, genuinely, or is it actually a glass obstacle course? Because all of this is not necessarily, written on the wall. It could be banter in the general workplace environment, etc. There's no particular event saying, you don't belong here, but people can very quickly pick that up because the brain is very good at that. So I think that's really thinking my 7 minutes is just about up. So really what I'm saying is that if we're interested in gender gaps, mind the gender gap. hope you get the pun. I'm saying that we're looking in the wrong place. We're focusing too much on the individual. We may be really well-meaning, putting lots of training opportunities in people's way, but we should say, actually, maybe the culture in which they're working is something we should be paying attention to as well. So the take-home message is something like, can we finally stop talking about male and female brains? Thank you very much.